It was the kind of evening that thickened the air with secrets, October wind murmuring through tall yew hedges and the sea crashing far off the cliffs, like a half-remembered dream. In the village of Marleycombe, where every door still had a name and not a number, a solitary manor brooded on the hilltop like a forgotten page in an old book. The manor was known as St. Dymphna's Retreat, once a nunnery, now a reclusive private club for artists and academics who fancied themselves philosophers of the midnight hour. Most called it the Midnight Club. Miss Jane Marple had never been inside, not until that Thursday. She arrived not by invitation but by necessity. The letter had come by morning post, plain, unmarked, save for the return address of St. Dymphna's. A former student of her late nephew Raymond had taken residence at the club, a Dr. Edith Turnstone, expert in medieval symbology, who now begged Miss Marple to visit under the gravest urgency without elaboration. Politeness alone would not have summoned Jane, but curiosity and something in the sharp tilt of the handwriting most certainly did. The manor's gates were open when she arrived, lanterns swaying from wrought iron posts. A woman in her 60s with watery gray eyes met her on the gravel path. "Miss Marple, I presume?" the woman said, almost mournfully. "I am Sister Mabel. Thank you for coming. I fear we are already too late." Before Jane could ask what she meant, a tall man in a worn herringbone coat appeared behind them. "She means Edith," he said grimly, "dead, locked in her study, no sign of violence, no sign of escape, and no explanation." He introduced himself as Lionel Carfax, a retired barrister and one of the 7 permanent members of the Midnight Club. Each of them resided at the manor during their sabbaticals, free to work in solitude or in what passed for intellectual company. Edith had been working on a translation of a 14th century manuscript, something about coded prayers and cloister politics. No one really understood it, but Edith, they all agreed, was brilliant and paranoid. She'd locked her study from the inside every night, refused meals, spoke rarely, but that morning when the maid brought up tea and no one answered, the door was broken down, and there she lay, slumped in her reading chair, spectacles askew, a half-finished letter in her lap. No mark on her body, no sign of struggle. Just a curious object on the table beside her, an ivory rosary, old and chipped, its cross twisted strangely, almost like it had melted. The room was sealed, Carfax insisted. One door, one small window bolted shut. Not even a cat could escape through it. Miss Marple's eyes drifted over the room. Tall shelves packed with dust-tinted volumes, a Persian rug buckling at the corner, a bronze crucifix above the fireplace. The hearth was cold. The fire hadn't been lit in days. A faint whiff of rosewater mingled with something, moustier, old vellum perhaps, or mildew. She walked to the desk where the letter remained untouched since the body had been discovered. It read, "Jane, please come. I fear I've awakened something I shouldn't have. Sister Magda knew. She tried to warn me, but I didn't listen. I couldn't. Not until last night." The ink trailed off in a blot, as if the pen had been yanked from her hand. "Sister Magda?" Miss Marple asked. "I thought you were Sister Mabel." "I am," the older woman replied. "Magda left us a year ago. Died in her sleep, peacefully. Or so we thought." That made Jane's brow arch slightly. And yet Edith referenced her yesterday. "She often spoke to the dead," said another voice, a younger woman in a velvet shawl, holding a wine glass she hadn't bothered to set down. She believed the veil between worlds was thin in this place, thought Sister Magda had unfinished business. She smirked. "We all have unfinished business. That's why we joined." The young woman was identified as Claudia Vine, a playwright whose most recent production had closed in London after a single week, according to Claudia, because it was too true for the stage. Jane found her distasteful. One by one, the other members were introduced. Professor Halcombe, a numismatist and amateur hypnotist, Miss Lena Broom, a botanical illustrator, Mr. Lionel Carfax, the barrister, and Sister Mabel, the former nun who maintained the chapel. Edith had made 7. That night they dined in silence, roast duck with bitter greens. No one spoke of the death, not directly, but every glance was weighted. Claudia drank heavily. Halcombe's hands trembled as he carved his meat. Lena refused to sit near the window, and Mabel kept touching the ivory rosary she now wore around her wrist like a bracelet. Jane noticed. After supper, she asked permission to return to the study. "Of course," Carfax said, "but I warn you there's nothing there. I've practiced law 30 years. There's no rational explanation." "But perhaps," Jane said softly, "there is a domestic one." She returned to the study alone, this time kneeling by the fireplace. There, beneath the iron grate, she found ashes, fresh ones, and buried in the soot, the charred remains of paper partially burned. She extracted it with a poker and examined what remained under the lamplight. Faded script in Latin, illuminated edges, but mostly destroyed. She tucked it into her handbag. As she stood to leave, she glanced again at the rosary on the table. The cross was not melted. It had been carved, reformed, as if into the shape of something else, something serpentine, and faintly beneath the ivory beads were tiny etchings, not Christian symbols, but pagan runes. Jane Marple did not believe in ghosts, but she believed in people, and someone in this house had gone to great lengths to make a death look like a message. That night, while the wind howled across the cliffs and lanterns flickered out in the hall, Jane sat quietly in her guest room, hands folded in her lap. The crime had taken place in a sealed room, no violence, no intruder, and yet the victim had known death was coming. Miss Marple whispered aloud, "No lock is truly perfect, and no alibi is without its crack." She had begun to see it now. The crack, small but widening. The crime was not unsolvable, but the answer would not lie in parchment or prophecy. It would lie in teacups, old habits, and one very human deception hiding behind the veil of the divine. Morning seeped in reluctantly, casting pale light across the somber halls of St. Dymphna's. A constable had been summoned in the night, and now the manor buzzed faintly with the business of procedural grief. Officers moved through corridors with careful detachment, photographing Edith Turnstone's study, bagging items from her desk, and asking questions that earned more confusion than answers. Miss Marple remained unassuming in the drawing room, wrapped in a shawl and sipping weak tea that Sister Mabel had brought her. She was not consulted, not officially. Her reputation as a keen mind had traveled to many corners of England, but not, it seemed, to Marleycomb's village constabulary. All the better, she thought. People speak more freely when they don't think you're watching. The inspector was a Mr. Dunswell, ruddy and serious, with the expression of a man trying to read a menu in a foreign language. "Poisoning's a possibility," he told the room with forced confidence. "Might have swallowed something. But no glasses, no cups, no syringe, no vial. If it was ingested, where's the vessel?" Claudia Vine offered a shrug without looking up from her cigarette. If she was poisoned, it was probably in her own mind. She was obsessed with relics and curses and God knows what. Honestly, she always struck me as the type to fancy a dramatic end. "Suicide?" Dunswell raised an eyebrow. "No," Jane said quietly, eyes still on the rosary Sister Mabel wore, looped around her wrist like jewelry. "If it were suicide, she would not have been afraid." Mabel blinked. "Afraid?" "She asked for me. Why would a woman on the brink of self-destruction reach out for help, mention an old warning, leave her work unfinished? She feared something, or someone, and she died before she could explain." Dunswell exhaled and rubbed his temple. "We'll wait for the coroner. In the meantime, best not to touch anything further." "I already have," Jane replied, and left it at that. She returned to the study once the constables had withdrawn. The scent of wax and old paper hung thick in the air. She took a slow breath and let her gaze wander, shelf by shelf, corner by corner. And there it was, a detail she hadn't noticed the night before. A teacup, not on the desk, not on the tray, but on the windowsill behind a curtain slightly askew, the porcelain catching a thread of morning sun. It was half full and cold to the touch. No lipstick, no sugar spoon. Jane stared at it a moment before carrying it downstairs where Sister Mabel was arranging flowers at the chapel altar. The nun looked up as Jane entered. "I was wondering," Jane said, voice gentle but firm, "how Edith came by a cup of tea in a locked room." Mabel's hands faltered slightly on the stems. She might have taken it in before locking up, or brought it down later. She was unpredictable. Jane nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing. "Yes, I expect she was, but you see, the cup was not on the tray, and it was still in the room, hidden, as if someone placed it there hurriedly. It suggests she had company, which would mean the door was never truly locked, or that someone had a way in." "She was alone," Mabel said too quickly. "She always locked her door at night. She was—" "Paranoid, yes," Jane interrupted, "but not careless. Someone was in that room after Edith thought herself safe. And I believe she tried to communicate that, not only in her letter to me, but in something else." She removed the charred parchment from her handbag. Mabel stepped back instinctively. "You shouldn't touch it. It's mostly ruined, but not entirely. Look, here, in the corner." She pointed to the edge, where a crude drawing had survived the flames. A serpent entwined with a cross, the same pattern carved into the ivory beads of the rosary Mabel now wore. "You took this from the desk after her death, didn't you?" The nun's lips thinned. I didn't think it was important. It belonged to the chapel, to Sister Magda, I believe." "No," Jane said. "It belonged to Edith, or rather she found it among Magda's things and kept it because she recognized its significance. A Christian rosary with pagan markings, a contradiction, or a clue. She knew someone had been deceiving her. She just hadn't worked out who." There was a long silence. Then from the doorway came a dry voice. "You think it was Mabel?" Claudia stood there, arms crossed, eyebrows raised. "I think it was someone who understood that Edith's research was leading her to a truth best kept buried," Jane said carefully, "and that they used Sister Magda's death to perpetuate a myth, one that could frighten or confuse Edith into silence, possibly even drive her to madness." "Magda was senile," Claudia said, "always muttering Latin nonsense. Edith latched onto it, said there was some secret society in the convent before it became a club, nuns hiding banned books, worshipping old gods under the church floorboards. Sounded like Gothic trash to me." "Not to Edith," Jane replied, "and not to whoever made sure she wouldn't publish it." A movement behind Claudia caught her eye, Professor Halcombe, eavesdropping. When he realized he was seen, he cleared his throat and stepped forward. "I overheard," he said awkwardly. "Miss Marple, if I may, I was fond of Edith. We all thought she was peculiar, yes, but brilliant. She did show me that rosary once and asked if I recognized the runes. I told her they resembled pre-Christian fertility markings. She didn't seem surprised, just frightened." "Did she say where she found it?" "Magda's old prayer box in the chapel crypt. We used to store forgotten items there. Never opened it myself." Jane's thoughts moved swiftly. "May I see this crypt?" Mabel hesitated but finally nodded. "Follow me." They descended narrow stone stairs, each step echoing in the cold silence. The crypt was small, dry, lined with votive alcoves and a single wooden chest, in the far corner. Mabel opened it, and inside were tokens of years gone, candlesticks, crumbling hymnals, a chipped statue of St. Agnes, and beneath it all a small linen pouch tied with faded red cord. Jane opened it. Inside, another rosary, identical to the one Mabel wore, but this one had no carvings, no runes, just plain ivory. She stared at Mabel, who looked suddenly ill. "You switched them," Jane said softly, "after Edith died. You took the altered one to hide its significance, but it was never yours to begin with." "I didn't know what it meant," Mabel whispered. "Only that Edith believed someone here was using the image of faith to mask something darker. She said it was hidden in plain sight. But when I saw her, dead, cold, I panicked." Jane tucked both rosaries away. The truth wasn't yet clear, but now she was certain of two things. Edith had discovered something tied to the club's forgotten past, and someone here wanted that past to remain buried. Whether it was fear, guilt, or something more sinister, they were only just beginning to unearth it. The late morning drew on with a sort of strained composure, as if the manor itself was holding its breath. Upstairs, constables tread softly through the study, like trespassers in a chapel, while downstairs the remaining members of the Midnight Club gathered in the lounge, sipping tea and offering each other polite silences. It was there that Miss Marple began her questions, not with accusations or insinuations, but with conversation, casual, seemingly harmless, yet weighted with precision. She began with Professor Halcombe, who sat by the fireplace polishing his spectacles with excessive care. He welcomed the distraction, his fingers twitching nervously with every pass of the cloth. "You said Edith showed you the rosary," Jane began, "and that she seemed frightened." "Yes," he said, not looking up. "I thought it a bit dramatic, frankly. She believed it connected to some clandestine order from the old convent days. I told her she was letting imagination get the better of her. She didn't appreciate that." "And yet you never told the others what she'd found?" Halcombe hesitated. "I thought it best not to fuel gossip. You've seen what this place is like. Intensely clever people with nothing to do but stew in their own ideas. Paranoia spreads fast here." "Astute of you," Jane said. "And where were you the night she died?" "In my room," he replied without pause. "Reading. I'd been asleep by 11. Anyone see you?" We keep odd hours here. Some of us don't sleep until dawn. Claudia, for instance, writes best after midnight." Jane noted that. "Thank you, Professor. You've been helpful." She turned her attention to Lena Broom, who sat in the sunroom sketching pale orchids with quick, distracted lines. Lena greeted her with a wary smile. "Such dreadful business," she murmured. "I keep thinking I'll walk past her door and hear that maddening Gregorian chant she always played." "You were close to her?" "No one was close to Edith, not really. She was polite but guarded." "Did she confide in you?" Lena shook her head. "She was kinder than the rest think, but no. She trusted few people. I think she'd been hurt before. Emotionally, I mean. Academia can be brutal." "Do you recall anything unusual the night she died? Sounds, movements in the corridor?" "I heard footsteps, I think, around midnight, but I assumed it was Claudia. She paces when she's stuck." Jane tilted her head slightly. "Were you awake that late?" "I'd had a headache. Chamomile didn't help, so I walked a bit. Tried reading. I must have gone to bed around 1. Again, Jane tucked the detail away. Halcombe claimed to sleep early. Lena had been up past midnight and heard footsteps. Claudia apparently often paced at night. "Thank you," she said softly. "One more thing. Do you know if Edith ever spoke to Mabel after discovering the rosary?" Lena paused. "I think she tried, but Mabel wouldn't engage. Said the past was meant to stay buried." Back in the lounge, Claudia Vine reclined on the divan, legs crossed, cigarette smoke curling like a question mark in the air. She watched Jane approach with a cool detachment, lips twitching with the beginning of a smirk. "Back again, Miss Marple? Going to ask whether I read any suspicious scripture lately?" "I thought I'd ask what you think happened to Edith," Jane said. Claudia leaned back. "I think she discovered something real, not supernatural, just human, a secret someone wanted left untouched." "You think someone here murdered her?" "I think someone made her believe death was inevitable, and then gave her the opportunity to walk into it." "You seem very sure." "I'm a playwright. Pattern recognition is my profession." "Then you must have noticed the way people speak of Sister Magda. Everyone treats her death as ordinary, and yet Edith wrote in her letter that Magda tried to warn her." "Mad old nun dies quietly," Claudia said. "A year later, her rosary shows up defaced with pagan symbols, and Edith begins to spiral. Maybe the warning was real. Maybe Magda knew something, but she didn't say it loud enough to save herself." "Did Edith ever confide in you?" Claudia hesitated just for a moment. "Once, 2 weeks ago. She said she thought she was being watched. Not by someone in the club, by someone in the chapel. She said she'd found something in the old confessional. I laughed, told her she was having a romantic breakdown." "Was she?" "Hard to say. She'd stopped eating with us, stopped joining our discussions. I think she felt the walls closing in." "Did she mention a name?" "No." Jane considered her. "And where were you that night?" "In the library, working on a draft. Ask the staff. They brought me coffee at midnight. I didn't go upstairs until 2. Jane said nothing. Claudia exhaled smoke, more forcefully this time. "You think I frightened her?" "I didn't. If anything, I wanted her to publish. I told her she had something juicy. She could have built her career on this. Or expose someone else's." Claudia smiled, but it was brittle. "Not mine, ideal in fiction." Jane left her with that and returned to the chapel, where Mabel now knelt alone, hands clasped, lips moving in silent prayer. Jane waited until the sister finished before speaking. "I spoke with everyone," Mabel stood slowly, "and each one tells a different story. Professor Halcombe says he was asleep early, but Lena heard footsteps past midnight. Claudia says she was in the library until 2, but no one can confirm. Lena heard her pacing, or thought she did. Everyone remembers something, but no two memories align, and not one of them can explain the extra teacup. Someone was with Edith that night." Mabel's eyes fell to the floor. "She came to me," she said finally. 2 nights before she died. She was terrified. Said she'd uncovered records, burial logs from the 1600s, names scratched out. Sister Magda had kept them hidden behind the altar stone. I told Edith to leave it be. "Why?" "Because she believed someone here had a lineage tied to those names, a surviving connection. If that got out, it would ruin someone." "Do you know who?" Mabel swallowed. "Number." "But I believe she tried to confront them. The day before she died, she asked to speak to each of us privately. I declined. The others, maybe one of them heard what she'd found and panicked." Jane watched her closely. "Who had the most to lose?" "I don't know." But Jane suspected someone did. That evening she returned to her room and sat by the window, the 2 rosaries laid before her. One marked, one plain. One truth, one mask. Each of them had something to hide. Each clung to a version of the night that danced just shy of certainty. And yet Jane could feel the pattern emerging, like ink slowly blooming through old linen. Deception had a voice in this house, and someone behind all the rituals and relics had been speaking it fluently. The storm broke around midnight, rain lashing the windows of St. Dymphna's like some spectral thing trying to claw its way in. Thunder rolled across the cliffs, muffled and brooding. Inside the manor, the air had grown heavy, not with weather but with waiting. Conversations had grown shorter, eyes less patient, as though the living felt the presence of the dead moving among them. Miss Marple had never been one to put faith in atmosphere alone, but she had learned long ago that guilt, fear, and deceit had their own kind of weather. And now it was thick as fog in every hallway. She sat quietly in the small library alcove beneath the stairs, the two rosaries resting beside her notebook, which was now peppered with initials, times, and partial quotations. She reviewed it again, lips moving silently. Edith had died alone in a locked room, so it appeared, yet someone had been there. The hidden teacup proved that, and someone had altered the rosary, turning it into a symbol that frightened Edith into secrecy. 4 people had the opportunity to place it. 3 had reason, but only 1 had tried to erase it. Mabel. She'd taken the carved rosary, tried to pass it off as ordinary. She claimed it was fear, but Jane knew the difference between fear and shame. Still, Mabel's motive was murky. She had no fortune to protect, no academic prestige to guard. If anything, she'd have gained credibility had she supported Edith's theory, unless what Edith found had threatened not Mabel's beliefs, but someone she had sworn to protect. Jane's thoughts turned to the others. Claudia Vine was clever, cynical, and calculating. The perfect playwright, yes, but also a woman whose last production had failed spectacularly. She'd spoken with Edith days before her death and admitted encouraging her to publish. Was it encouragement or manipulation? If Edith had produced damning historical evidence about some hidden cult within the convent walls, Claudia could have exploited it for her own gain. A new play, a scandal, a literary sensation. But then, Claudia wouldn't have silenced Edith unless she'd already lost control of the story. If Edith had refused to collaborate, refused to sell or share, then perhaps Claudia had panicked, or was that too convenient? Jane's fingers tapped the page. Professor Halcombe, retired, meticulous, visibly anxious. He claimed to have known nothing about the symbols, and yet he'd recognized them on sight. If he feared what Edith had discovered, he might have discouraged her purely out of caution. But what if he knew more? Halcombe had been part of the club for over a decade. If anyone had stumbled upon the chapel's deeper history, it would be him. Then there was Lena Broom, the quiet one. Overlooked, but artists were often better observers than anyone gave them credit for. Lena had heard footsteps that night. She said she'd had a headache. Yet when Jane spoke with the maid earlier, she'd mentioned seeing Lena in the corridor much earlier in the evening, around 10, heading upstairs with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Jane made a note. Lena, what was in the cloth? She closed the notebook slowly. It was time to stir the pot. The drawing room was dimly lit, fire casting flickering shadows against the paneling. Claudia and Halcombe sat with a decanter of sherry between them, speaking in hushed tones. Lena stood by the window, arms folded, staring at the rain. Mabel entered a few moments later with tea. It was the first time they had all been in the same room since the day before the death. I hope you'll forgive me, Jane began, stepping into the center of the room. But I've spent the past day listening very carefully, and I'm afraid some of what I've heard simply doesn't align. All heads turned to her. What are you implying? Claudia said, setting her glass down with a thud. That Edith was not mad, nor deluded. She discovered something real, frightening to her, yes, but real, and she tried to tell someone, maybe all of you. Halcombe shifted uncomfortably. Lena said nothing. She was afraid, Jane continued, not of ghosts, but of secrets. Someone tried to scare her into silence. Someone left her a rosary carved with pagan symbols. a mockery of her faith, or perhaps a warning, and someone entered her room that night with a cup of tea. Claudia stood slowly. "You're accusing us?" "I'm observing that all of you had something to lose if Edith spoke." Silence fell until Lena whispered, "What did she really find?" Jane looked at her. "Burial records, suppressed by the church. Names scrubbed out. A suggestion that, centuries ago, this convent sheltered a sect that blended Christian ritual with older pagan practices. Edith believed that someone here might be descended from that lineage. That's why she was afraid. Not of superstition, but of exposure." Halcom's mouth opened, then closed again. Claudia sat back down, her smirk gone. "And that," Jane said, "is the maze we're in. Greed, yes, if Claudia hoped to turn Edith's findings into a sensation. Fear, if Halcom thought she might destroy the club's credibility. And jealousy, perhaps, if Lena had reason to envy Edith's growing reputation." Lena stepped forward, voice soft. "She was better than me, but I didn't hate her." "No," Jane said, "but you saw something, didn't you? Something you didn't understand. And you said nothing." "I saw her in the chapel 2 nights before," Lena whispered. "She was weeping, not afraid, angry, like she'd been betrayed." Jane nodded. "And the cloth bundle? What was in it?" Lena flushed. "Paintings, sketches she gave me to critique. I didn't lie, I just didn't think it mattered." Everything pointed inward now, the noose tightening. Jane turned to Halcom. "You told me you'd never seen the chapel crypt's contents, but when Edith showed you the rosary, you knew what the symbols were. In fact, you knew too much. The way you avoided discussing Magda, the way you described Edith's research as dangerous. I think you discovered those records long ago and buried them again." His voice cracked. "I wanted to protect the place, the club, what we stand for. And you told someone who did worse than bury it." All eyes turned to Claudia. She stood again slowly. "She refused to share it," she said. "Said the world wasn't ready for the truth. She called it sacred. Sacred. It could have revived my career, could have made this place relevant, but she wouldn't even let me read it." Jane's voice dropped. "So you came to her room, with tea, with persuasion, and when that failed, what? You made her think she was cursed? That Magda's ghost was after her?" "I never touched her," Claudia snapped. "I swear to God I just wanted to scare her a little, make her desperate enough to collaborate." Halcom looked stricken. "You told her it was a curse?" "I told her what she already feared, that she was marked." Jane looked down at the rosaries. "One was a message," she said softly. "The other, a cover-up. And yet something still didn't fit. Claudia was cunning, yes, and reckless, but calculated. She wouldn't risk murder if she thought persuasion could work. Someone else had made the final move. Someone who believed protecting the club, or its secrets, was more important than Edith's life. Jane turned slowly to Mabel, who had remained quiet, eyes low. "Mabel," she said gently, "you said you took the carved rosary after the death. But I think you took it before. I think you found it among Magda's effects and realized what it meant. And when Edith began digging, you tried to stop her." Mabel's voice was a whisper. She was going to destroy everything. The chapel's legacy, the faith, the silence that gave this place meaning. I didn't want her to die. I only meant to humble her, remind her what she was tampering with. "You drugged the tea." Tears welled in the older woman's eyes. "She wasn't meant to die, just sleep, just forget." And finally, the room fell into stillness. Motives, Jane thought, were never pure. Each person here had grasped at something, power, prestige, protection. But it was not any single motive that killed Edith Turnstone. It was all of them, woven into a single tragic web. Inspector Dunswell returned the next morning, his coat soaked from the rain, and his mood as heavy as the clouds still dragging across the sea. Sister Mabel sat in the drawing room, her confession still echoing in the Manor's echoing silence, while the other members of the Midnight Club hovered nearby like wary ghosts. Claudia avoided eye contact. Halcombe had not shaved. Lena clutched a half-finished sketch with fingers trembling ever so slightly. "I've heard the whole account," Dunswell said briskly after Miss Marple presented her findings. "Drugged tea, rosary tampering, panic and unintended consequences. With Mabel's statement and the timeline you've reconstructed, I'd say we can consider the matter resolved. No need to draw it out." Miss Marple sat with her hands folded, face serene, but her eyes didn't share the inspector's satisfaction. "It's tidy," she said mildly. Dunswell raised a brow. "Isn't that what we want?" "It is what we are trained to want, but tidy is not always true." He grunted. "We'll get the coroner's report soon. If the autopsy confirms sedative compounds in the blood, then it's as good as done." "Assuming the tea is what killed her," Jane said. Dunswell frowned. "You believe it wasn't?" "I believe the tea was meant to be the cause, but intent and effect are not always equal, and there is something that still doesn't make sense." He leaned against the mantel. "Which is?" "She died writing to me, not after a slow drowsiness overtook her, but in the midst of action. The pen stroke ends in a blot, like her hand was yanked away. That doesn't align with a sedative, at least not one acting alone." Something interrupted her. Something sudden. Shock? Heart failure? Perhaps. Or something more direct. She rose and walked toward the fire, her voice low. "Mabel believes she caused the death. She's confessed to preparing the tea. But that confession came only after the conversation turned toward the crypt. She feared exposure, not guilt, and she never claimed to be in the room that night. So the question remains, if Mabel only prepared the tea, who delivered it? The maid insists she didn't." Dunswell frowned, and behind him, Claudia stirred in her chair. "I did," she said suddenly. "I brought it to her room." All eyes turned to her. "I wasn't going to say anything," she continued with a sigh, "because I thought it would incriminate me further. I brought her the tea as a peace offering. I was hoping she'd talk to me, finally let me read the documents she'd found, but she refused even to open the door. She just thanked me and said I should leave it outside." "So you never saw her?" Jane asked. "Number Y left the tea on a little tray by her door. I waited a few minutes, but she didn't say anything else." Halcombe snorted. "You expect us to believe you just wandered by with tea like a friendly neighbor?" "I was desperate," Claudia snapped. "You think I'm proud of it?" Dunswell scratched his head. "So you carried the tea Mabel drugged. Edith drank it, then died." "But when?" Jane asked. "She was found early in the morning, still dressed, letter mid-written, tea still partially full. There's no sign she'd been in bed at all. She was working, alert. If the sedative had taken hold, it didn't do so with any recognizable signs. And if it didn't work as intended, then what did?" A fresh silence fell. Then, as if summoned by thought, the constable entered the room with a brown envelope. "Coroner's early report, sir." Dunswell opened it swiftly, eyes flicking across the page. Then he froze. "No trace of barbiturates, no sedatives at all." Jane took the sheet gently. "Then the tea wasn't drugged after all." Mabel looked up, confused. "But I used the tincture, just a few drops. It was always enough to put Sister Magda to sleep when her nerves were bad." "If you used it, something must have gone wrong," Jane said, more to herself than anyone. "Or someone replaced it." Dunswell's brow furrowed. "But then, how did she die?" The constable cleared his throat. "Coroner believes the cause was asphyxiation. No sign of external pressure, more like suffocation from within." Airway closure, possibly due to allergic reaction. Jane froze, the weight of the implication settling fast. Did she suffer from any known allergies? No one answered, but Jane had already turned to Lena. You prepared Edith's meals sometimes, didn't you? Lena paled. Only when the staff were away. Once or twice I brought her snacks. Biscuits, fruit, but never anything dangerous. Did you bring her anything the night she died? I left some honey biscuits at her door. She liked them. Said they helped her sleep when she didn't want tea. Did they have nuts in them? Hazelnuts, Lena said softly. But she always ate them before. Jane's voice dropped to a hush. What if this time she didn't know? Lena stared at her, face unreadable. You think I poisoned her? I think she may have developed an allergy, or someone added a different ingredient, ground almond perhaps instead of hazelnut, something she didn't expect, something fatal. But I didn't. Lena stopped, her lips trembling. I don't believe you intended it, Jane said. But someone did. Dunswell frowned. So the tea wasn't drugged. The biscuits were. We've been chasing the wrong thing. Not quite wrong, Jane replied. Just incomplete. Claudia stood suddenly, anger boiling. So now it's Lena? No, Jane said calmly. Not Lena. She brought the biscuits, but someone had access to the kitchen beforehand. Someone with the presence of mind to switch one bag of flour for another, perhaps laced with ground bitter almond, rich in cyanide. A substitution subtle enough to escape notice. Halcombe's voice was low. We have a locked room, no sign of entry, a victim with no defensive wounds, a false lead about tea, and now poisoned biscuits. Not poisoned, Jane corrected. Altered, subtly, enough to provoke a lethal response in someone whose body couldn't handle it. She looked back at Claudia. You brought the tea. You say you didn't enter the room. But what if you did? What if she opened the door to you, just briefly, to thank you? Just long enough for you to place the tray. Maybe even the biscuits you'd brought earlier, now laced with danger. That's absurd, Claudia said. Why would I do that? To push her over the edge, Jane said, still watching her. But here is the rub. I no longer think you meant for her to die. Not truly. I think you thought the tea was drugged and the biscuits were benign. Just enough to muddle her thoughts. Make her desperate. I believe the true culprit was counting on you to carry the bait. Claudia's eyes widened. You mean, yes, someone used you, Claudia, just as they used Mabel's guilt, just as they used Edith's fear, someone who remained unseen while the rest of us danced. The room had grown so quiet one could hear the crackle of the fire. Inspector Dunswell looked up slowly. So, we don't have our murderer? Not yet, Jane said, but we've narrowed the path. Behind her, the wind rose again. The manor creaked, as if something deep in its foundation stirred with restless breath. The killer had not finished, and Jane Marple could feel it now. Eyes in the dark, waiting for her to miss a step. The rain passed sometime before dawn, leaving St. Dymphna's wrapped in a silver hush. The windows streaked with moisture and the grounds shrouded in drifting mist. The manor was still, as if it too was waiting, for clarity, for confession, for something to rise from the mire of half-truths. Miss Marple sat once more at the small writing desk in her room, the faint creak of the house her only companion. The previous day's revelations had disturbed the false calm that had settled after Mabel's confession. Everyone had retreated behind thin, polite facades, but Jane could feel the tension behind every glance, every word. Whoever had orchestrated Edith's death had not planned on so many witnesses, nor on such scrutiny. They had sown confusion with great care, building a web not out of lies but out of incomplete truths, subtle shifts, and manipulated guilt. Yet the story remained unfinished. The biscuits, the allergic reaction, a carefully prepared deception that had nearly succeeded. Claudia had been a pawn, Mabel a red herring, but neither had arranged the final stroke. Someone else had, someone watching from the shadows, weaving the past into the present. Jane turned to her notebook again, reading through each account, each inconsistency. Then her gaze caught on a line from an earlier conversation with Sister Mabel. Magda kept the old burial logs hidden behind the altar stone. Edith found them. She rose, took her shawl, and made her way silently to the chapel. The air inside was damp and faintly metallic, like old coin and candle wax. Morning light filtered through the stained glass in fractured hues, casting the figure of St. Dymphna across the stone floor in a broken halo. Jane knelt near the altar, hands brushing along the carved edges of the foundation. The stone was worn smooth by centuries of prayer, but just beneath the central pillar, her fingers found a groove. Not quite a drawer, but a slot. She reached inside and drew out a weathered, brittle-bound volume. Parchment, thin and dry as old skin. It smelled of dust and secrecy. Carefully, she opened it. The writing was Latin, scrawled in a looping script. It took her a moment to decipher the structure, dates, names, causes of death. Most were unremarkable: cholera, fever, childbirth. But as she turned to the later entries, something shifted. Several names had been carefully inked over with a different hand, one darker and more precise. These names shared no common surname, but were accompanied by odd notations. Hereticum suspicio, ritualis extra canonum, viduae servitia. Then one name leapt from the page: Honora Halcombe. Jane froze. She stared at the name, then at the date, 1632. It couldn't be coincidence. She flipped back through her notes, heart ticking like a clock about to strike. She'd asked Halcombe about his ancestry. He'd mentioned being descended from a long line of clerics and scribes. His family had lived in Devonshire for centuries. She'd taken it as idle pride. But now, with this name, she returned to the manor and waited in the breakfast room until Halcombe arrived, a copy of the Times tucked under his arm. "Good morning," she said gently. He nodded, cautious. "Miss Marple, still sleuthing?" "Only following where the story leads. I wonder, do you know of an ancestor named Honora Halcombe?" His brow furrowed. "Honora? No, not offhand. Why?" "She's listed in the convent's burial records. Died in 1632, marked with accusations of heresy and ritual transgressions. Odd phrasing. She wasn't excommunicated. She was contained." Halcombe paled, the color draining from his cheeks. I had no idea. Are you saying she was part of the sect Edith believed in?" "I'm saying Edith found that name and it frightened her, because she told me something curious in her letter. The past bleeds forward here, like candle wax over an old table. It hardens, but the shape of the flame remains. She believed someone here was connected not just metaphorically, but by blood. I didn't know. But perhaps someone else did." He looked at her, troubled. "Who?" "I don't know yet, but I think Edith told someone about your family, someone who feared what she'd found. Not because of scandal, but because of inheritance." A creak sounded behind them. Claudia stood in the doorway, half-dressed, hair unkempt. "Inheritance?" she said, voice rasping with disbelief. "You think this was about property?" "No," Jane said. "Something deeper, legacy, belief." Claudia stepped into the room. "You mentioned bloodlines before, hidden orders, secret rituals. It all sounded like paranoid fantasy, but now you think it's true?" "I think Edith believed it, and I think someone else did too, enough to kill for it." Halcombe sank into a chair. "If there's truth to it, it was buried long ago. We study history, we don't repeat it." "But someone did," Jane murmured. "Someone saw Edith's research as the spark that could rekindle old embers." She turned to Claudia. "Tell me, did Edith ever mention your family?" Claudia blinked. Mine? Number why would she? Because you and Halcombe are distantly related. Both of them stared at her. She traced the names, the altered rosary, the rituals. I think she believed that the sect had survivors who never left, who stayed here generation after generation, watching, waiting. The Midnight Club was her way of luring those secrets into the open. That's why she invited each of you. She believed one of you still carried the torch. Claudia backed away slowly. That's insane. But someone believed it, Jane said, voice soft as velvet and twice as cutting. Maybe not you, maybe not Professor Halcombe, but someone took her research, saw it as proof that they were part of something ancient, powerful, and sacred. She turned the final page in her notebook. What if the motive wasn't to suppress Edith's work, but to claim it? Outside, the chapel bell tolled softly, a single peal through the fog. Someone in this house saw themselves as heir to a forgotten covenant. Edith wasn't killed to stop her. She was killed to silence her and steal what she found. Mabel entered the room just then, carrying a covered dish. Her hands trembled slightly. Jane looked at her and something flickered in her mind. A moment from days earlier, Mabel placing fresh flowers in the chapel, lips moving in silent prayer. But it wasn't a psalm. It was a name, Honora. The flowers had been arranged in a distinct shape, not a cross, a spiral, ancient, pagan, ritualistic. Jane rose slowly. Sister Mabel, she said softly, you knew. Mabel didn't answer. She simply set the dish down and looked out the window. You weren't protecting Edith from her curiosity. You were guiding it, feeding it, until she went too far. Mabel finally turned, and her face was strangely calm. She was chosen, she whispered. She saw it. She just couldn't accept it. Jane's breath caught. Mabel, she said gently, what did you give her that night? Mabel smiled faintly. A key to the final truth. And then she walked away, humming an old, wordless tune. The case wasn't just about murder. It was about legacy, belief, and the terrible things people do in the name of destiny. The roots of the crime were not in the present. They had been planted centuries ago, in silence, in secrecy, and in blood. The morning air in St. Dymphna's had shifted again, no longer heavy with storm or dread, but sharpened with the brittle edge of inevitability. Miss Marple stood before the hearth in the drawing room, staring into cold ashes as the house moved cautiously around her. There was no more pretending, no more drawing room pleasantries or scholarly distraction. The truth had begun to seep out, and like cold water under a closed door, it would soon flood the whole house. But something still resisted. The killer, whoever they truly were, had not lost control. Not yet. They had allowed the web of confusion to tighten, perhaps even encouraged it. The false lead with the tea, the misdirection with the biscuits, the emotional smokescreens. And still they had left no visible fingerprints. Jane knew that the truth could not be drawn out by accusation. It would require something more indirect, something that slipped under the surface of rehearsed lies and touched the fault lines beneath. So she decided to set a trap. It began at breakfast. She arrived late, a rare departure from her habit, and entered the room already mid-conversation. Halcombe was engaged in a debate with Claudia over a quote from Augustine, while Lena sat quietly with her tea. Mabel, curiously, was absent. Jane took her seat, sipped her coffee, and with just enough volume to carry across the table said, I've been thinking about Honora Halcombe. Claudia blinked. Still? Yes, Jane said. I found something unusual in the burial records. Her name was annotated again, much later, in a hand that matches other recent editions, as if someone here had been editing the past. Halcombe frowned. Why would anyone do that? Jane set down her cup. To protect the legacy, or to shape it. You see, there was something else, an emblem drawn beside her name, very faint. I've asked a friend in London to analyze the symbol. I imagine we'll know more this evening. She let the statement hang in the air like a thread. Lena looked up. An emblem? Jane smiled gently. An unusual one, not Christian, older, a stylized spiral. According to preliminary sources, it was used by certain pre-Christian sisterhoods to denote chosen bloodlines. Halcom's face tightened. That's nonsense, is it? Jane tilted her head. It seems this spiral appeared elsewhere, too. Carved into a floorboard in the chapel. Burned faintly into the back cover of Edith's journal, and, I suspect, drawn in chalk beneath her bed. Claudia shifted uneasily. You're saying someone marked her? I'm saying, Jane replied carefully, that someone knew she had reached the truth, and marked her as either one of them, or a threat. She let her voice cool. But there's something else, something she wrote in the margin of her notes, 3 simple words, the final test. That made Lena sit up straighter. Jane caught the reaction. Yes, she said softly, that's what's been bothering me. Edith was scared, but she wasn't running. She thought she was being judged. Claudia scoffed. This is all circumstantial. Perhaps, Jane said, her voice now just above a whisper. But I think the person who killed her is here now. I think they're waiting to see if the rest of us are clever enough to catch up. The room held its breath. Later that afternoon, Jane set the second part of her trap. She asked each of the remaining club members to join her in the chapel, one at a time, under the pretense of inspecting the burial logs. She positioned the old book near the altar, open to Honora Halcom's entry, with the spiral faintly redrawn beside it. But more importantly, she left something beside it, a small folded note that read, "The line remains unbroken. The light returns through the chosen." It meant nothing, at least not obviously, but it had a purpose. Claudia was the first to arrive. She knelt briefly, studied the pages, read the note, and scoffed aloud. "Pretentious rubbish," she muttered and left. Halcom came next. He read the entry slowly, expression unreadable. When he reached the note, his lips pressed together, but he said nothing. He merely tucked his hands into his coat and walked away. Then came Lena. Jane watched from the shadows beyond the vestry door, concealed by hanging robes. Lena stepped carefully to the altar, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. She read the book. She picked up the note. She froze, and then slowly she opened her sketchbook and slid the note inside, tucking it between 2 pages as though it belonged there, as if it had found its way home. Jane's breath caught. When Lena left, Jane waited several minutes before retrieving the sketchbook from Lena's room. It was unlocked, innocently, foolishly, and inside, between pages of charcoal sketches, she found not just the note she had planted, but others. Phrases written in the same cramped, frantic hand, repeated symbols, names, and at the center, a rough portrait of Edith, surrounded by spirals, crosses, and flames. Jane brought the book down to the study and waited. Lena found her there just before sunset. "I knew you'd take it," she said softly. Jane looked up. "Why didn't you destroy it?" "Because it isn't madness, it's truth. I didn't understand it at first. I thought Edith was unraveling. But then I saw it too, the patterns, the signs. She wasn't imagining them. She was remembering them." Jane kept her voice neutral. "And you believed you were chosen?" "I didn't believe it. I knew we both were. She just didn't accept it. She wanted to reveal it to the world. I wanted to preserve it." "You altered the biscuits." Lena flinched, eyes watering. She wouldn't listen. She said she would burn the chapel if it meant exposing the lie. "But it's not a lie, Miss Marple. The bloodline, the spiral, the vow, it's all real." "And so you killed her?" "No." Her voice cracked. "I gave her the test. She failed. Jane stood, the room deadly quiet now. You believe you're the continuation of some ancient line. I am. Lena's hands trembled. So was Honora. So was Magda. But only one may carry the light forward. Jane moved to the door. I've heard many justifications for murder, she said quietly, but yours may be the loneliest. Lena didn't stop her, not when she stepped into the corridor, not when the constable approached, not even when they took her sketchbook. She only sat in the study, humming, staring at a spiral she'd drawn on the desk in salt from a spilled shaker, and Jane walked out into the dusk with the chilling certainty that belief, when left to rot in silence, could become the most dangerous weapon of all. The evening fog rolled in thick and fast over the cliffs, swallowing the outlines of St. Dymphna's with a strange, muffled silence. A hush clung to the manor, as though the very walls were reluctant to speak. Within, the warmth of gas lamps and the low crackle of fireplaces offered little comfort. Lena had been taken into quiet custody, removed under the pretense of needing rest, though the constable's firm hand and her murmured chants told a clearer truth. But even as her absence settled into the air, something gnawed at Jane Marple. Something raw and unresolved. Lena had confessed to believing, to testing, but belief alone was not guilt, and madness could be both genuine and convenient. Jane had seen too many confessions crumble under scrutiny, too many scapegoats wrapped in guilt they hadn't earned. She returned to her room, unease prickling beneath her skin. The sketchbook rested on her writing desk, where she had left it earlier with Inspector Dunswell's approval. It held drawings and symbols, the planted note, and, most crucially, Lena's own words, the rambling, fevered phrases that charted a descent into obsession. Jane had planned to study it more closely that evening, to follow Lena's spirals back to their source. But when she opened the book again, her fingers turned pages that were too light. She froze. Half the pages were gone. Cleanly removed, not torn or shredded, but sliced, expertly and precisely, as though by a scalpel. The middle section, where the spirals intensified, where Lena had transcribed Edith's notes in her own scrawl, was missing. Her pulse quickened. She checked the wastebasket, the floor, the edges of the desk. Nothing, no cut scraps, no torn edges, just a surgical absence. She rang for the constable. He arrived within minutes, and she showed him the sketchbook. His face darkened. I left it on the desk myself after sealing the room. You're sure no one came in? I was out for less than an hour, Jane said. And I locked the door. He glanced around, then toward the window. It was slightly ajar, barely an inch, but enough. The night wind stirred the lace curtain gently. Someone came in through there. It's a long drop to the courtyard, he muttered. Jane didn't reply. She crossed to the window, looked out. Below, the stones were slick with mist. If someone had scaled the wall or climbed a drain pipe, there would be marks, signs of disturbance. But the fog was too thick now to see clearly. The constable swore under his breath. Could be one of the others, he said. Claudia, maybe, or even Halcombe. You think they'd destroy evidence? I think someone believes the truth is more dangerous than a confession. He left to alert Dunswell, and Jane remained, staring down at the gutted book. It hadn't been Lena. She was under observation. Her belongings had been searched, which meant someone else had known exactly what to remove, and how. That level of precision pointed not to panic, but intent. Knowledge. The house had grown smaller in the past hours. Fewer suspects, fewer masks, and yet the remaining faces, Claudia, Halcombe, even Mabel, still carried too many shadows. At dinner, Jane made careful note of their behavior. Claudia was tense, biting the inside of her cheek, fingers drumming against her water glass. But her sharpness had dulled. Not fear, resentment. She looked like a woman who had once thought herself the protagonist, only to find herself a pawn. Halcombe was quieter than ever, pale, withdrawn. He spoke only when spoken to and avoided Jane's gaze. Mabel did not come down at all. As the meal wound down, Jane made her move. "I've asked Inspector Dunswell to allow me access to the club records," she said conversationally. "I believe Edith may have left something behind in her application or correspondence, perhaps a name." A hint Claudia's head snapped up. "You think she knew her killer before she died?" "I think she suspected them. She was drawing connections, historical, genealogical, spiritual. She would have noted something, even if she didn't know what it meant at the time." Halcombe's spoon clinked against his bowl. Would that even matter now? With Lena? "Lena believed," Jane interrupted. "But she wasn't the one editing history, nor removing pages from evidence. That was someone else." The room chilled. After dinner, she slipped away to the old records room beneath the East Wing stairs. The Midnight Club archives had been kept in brittle file boxes, correspondence, copies of essays, proposals for talks. Edith's file sat near the top, neatly labeled. Inside was the expected, her membership letter, a list of lecture topics, 2 pages of handwritten research notes. But tucked at the back was a scrap of a letter, not from Edith but to her. It was unsigned and undated, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was Halcombe's. "Miss Turnstone, you must proceed with caution. What you seek is not hidden, but buried. There is a reason no one has unearthed it. Some knowledge does not want to be known. Speak of this to no one, especially not Claudia. She thinks of drama, not consequence." J.H. Jane's breath caught, so he had known. He'd tried to warn her, but why deny it? Why conceal it after her death? The constable returned. Minutes later, winded, face grim. "Mabel's room," he said. Jane followed him through the corridors to the guest wing, where Sister Mabel had been given a modest corner room. Her suitcase was open, half-packed, but she was gone. The window was wide open, and the faint, muddy outline of a shoe print marred the sill. The groundskeeper had seen a figure moving toward the wood just before dusk, but he'd thought nothing of it. A note rested on the bed, written in a graceful hand. "I gave her the key, but she walked through the wrong door. I stayed to protect the truth, but the truth does not want guardians. Tell Miss Marple she's not finished yet. M." The constable swore again, more viciously this time. Jane said nothing, not rage, not surprise, but a calm certainty fell over her. The key was gone. The pages were gone. The suspect was gone, but not the truth. Someone still in the house had arranged all of it, used Lena's belief, used Mabel's guilt, used Claudia's ambition, and now they were covering the trail. Not to escape, not yet, but to finish what Edith had begun. Only one piece remained, the one they hadn't expected to survive. Jane Marple. The wind howled along the cliff's edge that night with an almost human voice, pressing against the old walls of St. Dymphna's like a thing desperate to be let in, or let out. In the dim light of the manor's upper landing, Jane Marple stood motionless, reading Mabel's final note once more. The room behind her had gone still, the constable standing by in silent frustration as the echo of Mabel's escape still rang in their ears. But Jane's attention had shifted. She had noticed something. Not in the note, not in the suitcase, but beside the hearth in Mabel's room. A smear of soot across the floorboards, and, nestled just beneath the edge of the rug, the charred remains of a matchbox, and something else. A fragment of scorched parchment. She retrieved it carefully with tweezers, placed it on a handkerchief, and peered closer. Barely legible under the blackened edge was a word, or part of one, illumina, the same Latin root as illumination. Mabel had destroyed something, perhaps something connected to the missing sketchbook pages. But why leave this much behind? Why leave anything at all? She was about to ask the constable to fetch Dunswell when the scream rang out. It was sharp, high, and strangled, ripping through the quiet like a blade through linen. Then came the thud of something falling, followed by hurried footsteps and the clatter of running down the central stairs. Jane rushed out without a coat, her slippers barely making a sound on the stone floor. The cry had come from the drawing room. Halcombe, perhaps, or Claudia. She didn't allow herself to hope that it hadn't been worse. She reached the doorway and froze. Claudia stood at the center of the room, her hands red and trembling, her eyes wide and blank. Her left wrist bled from a gash, and lying crumpled by the fireplace in a twisted, contorted sprawl was Halcombe. Jane moved quickly, checking his pulse. Faint, but there. He was breathing, shallow and uneven. His glasses were cracked, half fallen from his face. Blood seeped from a cut at his temple, likely from the edge of the stone hearth. Claudia was shaking now, unable to speak. The constable entered seconds later, then Dunswell, still buttoning his coat, eyes bleary but sharp. "What happened?" he barked. Claudia stared at them. He said I needed to stop her, that she would burn everything down. He pulled something from his coat, a paper, and told me to take it. When I refused, he grabbed my arm. And then, I don't know, I pushed him. He fell." She held up her arm. The gash oozed steadily. Jane looked around the room, her eyes narrowing. There was no sign of any paper now, no document, no folder. The fireplace glowed with recent flames. "Fetch the surgeon," Dunswell ordered the constable, "and bring clean bandages. Move." When they were alone, Jane knelt beside Halcombe again. His lips moved faintly. She leaned closer. "Wrong one." Her heart gave a quiet stutter. Claudia heard it too. "What did he say?" "Nothing," Jane murmured. "He's barely conscious." But her thoughts were racing. The wrong one. Had he meant Claudia, or had he meant Lena, or Edith? She rose and faced Claudia fully. "Tell me exactly what he said when he gave you the paper." Claudia clutched her wounded arm. "He said the others had misunderstood, that Edith had chosen someone, not him, not Mabel, someone else. He said he had proof. He wanted me to join him, to carry it forward." Jane's voice was razor sharp. "Carry what forward?" "I don't know," Claudia cried. "Some lunatic belief in bloodlines and prophecy. He said Edith was part of it, that she wanted to crown a successor, someone worthy." "And did he say who that was?" Claudia looked down. "Number just that she left it behind. He said Mabel stole it, but she didn't understand it. She was the key, not the lock. And then he got agitated, said time was running out, that he needed to light the fire. I thought he was threatening to burn something. He reached for me. I panicked. I shoved him." Jane turned slowly toward the fire. The ashes were fresh. A faint shape, part of a folded corner, remained unburned, lodged near the grate. She took the poker and teased it free. It was the edge of a photograph. More precisely, a photograph of a painting. She recognized it. It had once hung in the upstairs hall. A portrait of a woman in dark robes, her hands clasped over a rosary. Honora Halcombe, according to the brass plaque. But in this photo, the image had been altered. Someone had drawn the spiral into the shadows behind her head. And below it, a caption, "The one who carries both flame and silence." Claudia stepped forward, voice shaking. "He said it was me." "Because you matched a painting?" "Because I was born here," she whispered. "Because I came back." Jane felt her mouth go dry. "But that's not why Edith invited you." Claudia looked at her. "She invited you," Jane said carefully, "because she feared you, because you were ambitious, inquisitive, and proud. She suspected you'd been manipulated, used, but you weren't the successor. You were the warning." Dunswell re-entered just as the doctor arrived. Halcombe was lifted carefully to a stretcher and taken to the infirmary. Claudia followed in stunned silence, her bandaged wrist held close, but Jane stayed behind, crouching before the fire. Beneath the photograph had been something else, a seal, melted wax, the remnants of string. A package had been burned here, something that could not be allowed to survive. She pressed her palm to the cold stone floor. Someone was still at work. Someone had tried to kill Halcombe or provoke Claudia into doing it. Someone who had taken the prophecy, the symbol, the mythology, and made it real. Not Lena, not Mabel, not even Halcombe. Someone who was always there, just beyond the light, watching the players twist and falter. Miss Marple stood and turned slowly toward the door, her face calm but her eyes sharpened to a blade's edge. The killer had struck again, but this time they had made a mistake. They had shown their hand just enough. And now Jane would make them reveal the rest. ChatGPT said, "The quiet after the storm was brittle, sharp-edged as Jane Marple stood once more in the library, the fading dusk spilling long shadows across the rows of worn leather-bound volumes. The manor had been rattled, shaken by violence and secrecy, yet amid the chaos, something had begun to reveal itself, not in grand gestures or bombastic confessions, but in the smallest things, the almost invisible threads weaving the whole tapestry tight." She sat down, reopened her notebook, and ran a finger along the margin where she had scribbled hastily during the long hours of questioning. The notes, the statements, the broken fragments of stories, each contained a detail overlooked by others, a pattern too subtle to grasp at first glance. The rosary, it had appeared in almost every interaction, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. The altered rosary found in Edith's room had first seemed an anomaly, an odd curiosity, a decorative trinket imbued with mysterious symbols. But now Jane realized it was something far more deliberate. She recalled the moment she saw Sister Mabel placing fresh flowers on the altar, the petals arranged not in a cross but in a spiral, an ancient symbol repeated again and again in the burial logs, the journals, and even the sketchbook. The spiral was the constant motif, the unseen signpost guiding every move in this shadowed game. And the rosary, each bead carved not with traditional saints or crosses, but with delicate spirals and cryptic runes. Jane rifled through her memory of the Midnight Club's members, recalling who had touched, handled, or mentioned the rosary. Claudia had dismissed it as paraphernalia, but had clearly noticed its significance, too much to be casual. Halcombe's notes had included diagrams of ancient religious symbolism, spirals etched into stone, painted in hidden chapels, woven into tapestries. Lena's sketches were saturated with spirals, covering portraits, rooms, even faces. And Mabel, the quiet guardian who had disappeared, had arranged flowers in the chapel in the same unmistakable shape. Jane's gaze lifted toward the display cabinet by the fireplace. Inside rested the rosary, preserved and locked away after the initial investigation. She approached, hands steady despite the storm of revelations. The beads gleamed faintly under the lamplight. A small, almost imperceptible crack ran through the third bead from the cross. She had noticed it earlier but dismissed it as wear. Now it struck her like a revelation. Jane retrieved the rosary and turned it gently in her hands. Watching how the light caught the fracture, she pressed the bead lightly, a soft click. The bead shifted slightly, revealing a hidden compartment within. Inside was a tiny folded piece of vellum. With careful fingers, she unfolded the fragile parchment. It bore a map, a crude hand-drawn sketch of St. Dymphna's estate, marked with a series of X's and a looping spiral at the center. Beneath the map, a single sentence penned in a familiar hand. "The flame lives where the spiral ends." Jane's mind raced. She had seen this phrase before, in Edith's notes, in Lena's sketchbook, in the burned fragments by the hearth. It was a riddle, a clue, and it was the key to the hidden truth. She turned the map over, noting the outline of the manor's grounds, the chapel, the gardens, the cliff path. But most curiously, the spiral marked a spot not within the chapel or the house, but deep in the overgrown walled garden on the western side of the estate, a place no one had explored fully. Jane knew what she had to do. She found the constable and explained her discovery. Together they gathered a small lantern and set out through the fog-swathed grounds. The walled garden was a tangle of brambles and weeds, forgotten paths swallowed by years of neglect. The air was cool and thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Jane followed the map's markings, her steps careful but purposeful. At last she reached the center, a circle of ancient stone, half covered in moss, the spiral carved deep into its surface. She knelt and brushed away the grime, revealing a shallow depression at the spiral's core. Using the tip of the lantern, she pressed lightly. The stone shifted with a groan and slowly slid aside, revealing a narrow passage descending into darkness. A chill crept along her spine. This was the secret beneath St. Dymphna's, the legacy hidden from the light, the root from which all, the whispers and deaths, had grown. Jane hesitated only briefly before drawing a deep breath and stepping into the cold, musty tunnel. The walls closed in, damp and rough beneath her fingertips. The air grew cooler, heavier. Her lantern cast trembling shadows on ancient bricks. At the end of the passage, a small chamber awaited. Inside, faint flickers of candlelight illuminated a wooden chest, adorned with the same spiral symbol. Jane approached, heart pounding. The chest's lid was unlocked, but thick with dust and cobwebs. Inside, wrapped in faded velvet, lay a bundle of parchments tied with a silver ribbon. Carefully she untied them, revealing a series of letters and journals, handwritten by Honora Halcombe herself. The letters told a story of faith, rebellion, and forbidden knowledge, a secret sisterhood bound by blood and silence, guardians of an ancient flame meant to burn away corruption, but now lost to time. Jane's eyes fell on a final note, dated mere days before Honora's death. It spoke of betrayal, of a chosen heir, and of a pact made in shadows to protect the secret at any cost. The pieces fell together. This was no mere murder born of petty jealousy or ambition. It was the climax of centuries-old secrets carried in bloodlines, hidden in symbols, and defended with ruthless devotion. Jane folded the papers carefully. Outside, footsteps echoed in the tunnel behind her. She turned swiftly. Claudia stood there, face pale but resolute. "You found it," Claudia whispered. Jane nodded. "The truth, but not the whole story." Claudia stepped forward. "I wanted to protect it, but I was afraid that those who seek the flame don't care who they burn." Jane studied her quietly. "And who do you think holds the flame now?" Claudia hesitated, then smiled faintly, a shadow crossing her eyes. "Someone who's been hiding in plain sight." Jane realized then that the final game was only just beginning. The pattern was clear now, but the player was still elusive, watching, waiting for her next move. And St. Dymphna's held its breath once more, caught between light and shadow, truth and deception, in a dance as old as the stones beneath their feet. Claudia's voice trembled in the cold chamber, her figure framed by the flickering lantern light that danced over the ancient parchments. "I wanted to protect it, but I feared what it truly meant," she whispered, folding her hands tightly as if holding back a storm within. "You see, it's not just about bloodlines or old secrets, it's something darker." Jane looked at her steadily, her curiosity sharpened by the weight of the moment. "Go on." Claudia inhaled slowly, forcing herself to meet Jane's gaze. "The flame. It's a symbol, yes, but it's also a curse. It demands sacrifice, not for power, not for glory, but for something more absolute." Jane's mind raced through the clues, the spirals, the symbols carved into stone and etched in ink, the obsession that had consumed Edith, Lena, and even Mabel. But what had eluded her was the reason why someone would kill to keep this secret alive. Claudia's voice grew firmer. The flame is a promise of purification, not in the sense of cleansing the soul, but cleansing the lineage. It's about erasing weakness, weakness of spirit, of blood, of will. And the chosen bearer is tasked not only with preserving the secret, but with enforcing that purification, however terrible the cost. Jane's fingers tightened around the edge of the parchment. You believe the murders were to protect this purification, to ensure the bloodline remained pure? Yes, Claudia said, but it's more than that. It's fear, fear of imperfection, fear of legacy being tainted. Edith discovered the truth too late. She was no longer the flame's bearer. Someone else had been chosen, someone who would wield it mercilessly. And when Edith threatened to expose the truth, she had to be silenced. Jane's eyes searched Claudia's face, noting the coldness behind her fear, the resigned acceptance. And that someone, is it you? A bitter laugh escaped Claudia's lips. I wish it were that simple. No, the bearer is someone hidden in plain sight, someone who wears the mask of innocence but commands the club's loyalty through fear and devotion. Jane swallowed. Someone you trusted? Claudia nodded slowly. Someone who has manipulated every one of us, weaving deception and using our desires and fears to keep control. Lena's obsession was a tool, Mabel's loyalty a shield. Halcom was a pawn too, but his knowledge made him dangerous. Jane closed her eyes briefly, the pieces shifting into a terrible clarity. The second attack, the vanishing evidence, the subtle psychological maneuvers, it all pointed to a master manipulator who thrived in the shadows, ready to strike again if necessary. Why the spiral? Jane asked. Claudia's gaze darkened. Because the spiral represents the cycle, the endless loop of purification and sacrifice. It is both a symbol and a chain, and until the bearer breaks free, the cycle continues. A sudden noise in the corridor jolted them both. Jane's hand moved instinctively to the small dagger she always carried, a relic she had taken from the chapel's altar earlier, a symbol turned tool of defense. They exchanged a glance, and Jane whispered, "We must be cautious. The bearer knows we are close." Claudia nodded. They will come for the documents, for the evidence, for us. Together they hurried back up the tunnel, the weight of centuries pressing on their backs. As they reached the top, Jane's mind was already racing through the final steps to unmask the villain. The pieces were there, hidden in plain sight, woven into the rituals and relationships of the Midnight Club. The true motive was not greed, nor simple revenge, but the fanatic devotion to a destructive ideal, a belief that justified murder and madness as necessary purges. Jane knew the final confrontation was near. The bearer would reveal themselves soon, because in such twisted games the hunter often makes the fatal mistake of revealing their hand too early. And when they did, Miss Marple would be waiting, ready to bring the flame out of the shadows and into the cold light of justice. Rain began to fall as dusk descended on St. Dymphna's, soft and steady, like a curtain drawing closed. The manor, surrounded by cliffs and whispers, seemed to exhale as Jane Marple returned to the main hall, the spiral map folded tightly in her coat pocket and Claudia trailing a half-step behind her. They didn't speak much as they ascended the central staircase. There was no need. Everything had been said in the walled garden, beneath the earth where secrets had lain too long untouched. They knew now what the flame symbol truly meant, and that someone still inside this house was prepared to kill again to protect it. The constable met them at the landing, his eyes anxious. "Miss Marple," he said, "Halcom's awake." That was earlier than expected. "He's lucid. Barely, but he's asking for you." They found him resting in a narrow infirmary bed, tucked into one of the side rooms, the smell of antiseptic clinging faintly to the air. His face was pale and bruised, his breath shallow. Yet his eyes were sharp, sharper than Jane had ever seen them. "You were right," he murmured. "It was never Lena. It was never Edith, not fully. It was always her." Jane nodded. "You mean the true bearer of the flame?" "She made us believe we were chosen," he said hoarsely. "She needed followers, believers, but she never believed in us." Jane leaned closer. "Who?" His eyes flicked toward the window, where the rain ran in rivulets down the glass. He whispered the name, and even though Jane had already suspected, it chilled her blood all the same. The final piece clicked into place. She rose quietly. "Rest now, Mr. Halcombe. You've done your part." Then she turned and walked out into the corridor. She found Claudia waiting outside the chapel. Together they lit only a few candles and arranged the old altar with deliberate care. The spiral rosary sat at its center, the old parchment map beside it. The dagger gleamed under the faint flame, its silver handle shaped like a serpent devouring its tail. Then Jane sent word for Inspector Dunswell, and finally she sent word to Sister Ignatia. She arrived without resistance, calm, quiet, hands folded in front of her, robes as immaculate as they'd been on the day Jane first arrived. "You wish to see me, Miss Marple?" she asked softly. Jane nodded. "Please, come in. I have something to show you." Ignatia stepped across the threshold, and Jane watched her eyes flick to the altar. The moment was so brief, so subtle, that only someone with Jane's precision would have caught it. Not surprise, recognition. She gestured to the parchment. "We found this beneath the garden, in the place the spiral led." Ignatia's gaze did not waver. "I see." "You were there once," Jane said calmly. "With Honora, perhaps even before that." Ignatia's voice remained soft. "You've come very far, Miss Marple. But some secrets were meant to be protected." Jane's expression didn't change. "Even if they require murder." Ignatia's lips pressed together. For the first time, a flicker of something passed across her face. Not guilt, not fear, but a kind of sadness, as if Jane had failed a test. "You misunderstand. Edith was never supposed to die. She was meant to prepare the next guardian. But she doubted. She wrote too much. She let others see. You silenced her." Number Y warned her. Her eyes met Jane's. She wouldn't listen. Jane stepped forward. "You stole the pages. You planted the key. You manipulated Mabel into helping you burn the last pieces of Edith's legacy. And then you let Lena spiral into madness, knowing her obsession made her the perfect scapegoat." Ignatia didn't flinch. "They were willing. That is the tragedy of it. People yearn to be chosen. It takes very little to push them." "And Halcombe?" "He threatened to expose the chamber before I could recover what was left. I didn't push him, but I allowed the confrontation to unfold." "And now?" Jane asked. Ignatia glanced at the altar once more. "Now you have what you came for. You have truth. But what will you do with it? The flame is not just an idea, Miss Marple. It is a way of seeing the world. We do not simply kill. We purify." Jane shook her head. "You mean you destroy anyone who threatens your myth?" "I protect balance," Ignatia said quietly. "You see cruelty. I see necessary silence. Do you think the world is made better by dragging every darkness into the light?" Jane turned to the constable, who stepped from the shadows behind the chapel doors. "You heard it all?" "Every word," he said grimly. Ignatia looked at him, then at Jane. "You cannot stop it," she said softly. "Even if I go, another will rise. The spiral is always turning." Jane stepped between her and the altar. "Then it will turn in the light. No more shadows." Ignatia did not resist as she was taken away. Later that night, Jane stood once more beneath the chapel dome. alone now. The wind had died, the storm had passed, and the rosary still gleamed beneath the candlelight, its spiral no longer a symbol of fear but of something broken, something that could not control people anymore. Not here. Not now. She took the final parchment from her coat pocket, Edith's last letter preserved by sheer accident in Claudia's notes. In it, Edith had written, "Let the spiral end with me. The flame is not a gift. It is a burden dressed in ritual. I chose silence. I only hope others will too." Jane burned it gently, in the candle's flame, and watched the ashes fall. The case was over. The truth had come to light. But Miss Marple, ever watchful, knew some spirals take longer to break than others. She would be ready. The storm had passed. Morning came with reluctant gray light pressing through the stained glass windows of St. Dymphna's, bleeding pale colors across the cold stone floor. The manor stood hushed, as if exhaling after a long, bitter exorcism. The constable had escorted Sister Ignatia into custody just before dawn. Her confession, measured, calm, and without remorse, was already being transcribed by Dunswell's men, who moved about the manor with stiff formality, eager to mark the case resolved. Miss Marple, however, did not feel the final knot had been tied. She stood by the east corridor window, her eyes not on the view, but on her own reflection. There was something wrong, not wrong in the way of missed evidence or a clever lie, but wrong in the rhythm, like a story that ended too neatly, too early. A curtain drawn when the play still had one act left. It was the flame. Not as a symbol, but as an object. The dagger. She had left it on the chapel altar when Sister Ignatia had been taken away. But when she returned after sunrise to retrieve it, hoping to place it with the other evidence, it was gone. No trace of forced entry, no footsteps in the dust. The spiral rosary was untouched, the altar otherwise undisturbed. Only the dagger, forged with that distinctive serpent-shaped hilt, had vanished. Jane's unease deepened. She made her way quietly through the manor, retracing steps not from the beginning of the case, but from its end. Halcombe was still unconscious. Claudia was asleep under sedation. Lena, her psyche shattered, had been taken under medical supervision days before. Mabel remained missing, and Dunswell was packing. She found him in the drawing room, his bags beside him, a fresh overcoat folded neatly across a chair. "I didn't expect you'd be leaving so soon," she said softly. He turned, startled. "Miss Marple, I was just, well, the case is over. There's little more to do." "That's one view of it." He tilted his head. "You doubt the confession?" Not the confession," she said, walking slowly across the room. "But I do doubt the narrative. It's too clean. Sister Ignatia admitted to manipulation, yes, but not to murder, not to the push that nearly killed Halcombe, not to the fire, not to the missing evidence. And now the dagger is gone." He frowned. "Gone?" "Vanished from the altar less than an hour after your men locked the chapel." He blinked, then gave a small, measured nod. "Perhaps one of the constables moved it for evidence?" I asked. "None of them even knew it was there." Her voice sharpened just slightly. "You did, though. You were in the chapel with us. You saw it on the altar." There was a moment of silence between them, not long, but enough. "You've solved the case?" he said. "Surely you can allow the details to settle." But Jane was already looking at his bag, the smallest one, half-zipped. She stepped toward it. Dunswell moved just slightly, barely a shift in weight, but enough. "That bag," she said gently. "May I?" He didn't answer. She unzipped it slowly. Inside, wrapped in a clean white handkerchief, lay the dagger, its blade polished, the serpent hilt gleaming faintly in the low morning light. Dunswell said nothing. The silence stretched, but it wasn't confusion that filled it. It was something colder, something quieter. Jane lifted the weapon, carefully rewrapping it and placing it on the table. "Why take it?" he breathed through his nose. "Because it was meant to end with me." Her eyes did not move from his. "You weren't just investigating, were you?" "No," he said. "I was finishing something." She understood then, the missing weight in the story, the final unspoken twist. "You were Honora Halcombe's grandson." He nodded once. "Not Halcombe's," she continued. "Edith's brother was your father, wasn't he? But he left, turned his back on all of this. You came back not to investigate, but to cleanse, to erase the last traces of the spiral's legacy." He exhaled. "I tried to do it cleanly. I let Ignatia run her rituals. I let them burn their secrets. But it was never enough. Edith clung to it. Mabel tried to preserve it. Halcombe, he thought he could control it. But the spiral consumes. Always." Jane's voice softened, but her words were sharp. "So you killed Mabel?" "No," he said. "She ran. She saw what I was doing. She knew, but she didn't try to stop me." Jane paused. "And Halcombe?" He looked away. "I didn't push him, but I wanted to. When I saw the map in his hands, the true map, I knew he'd been closer to the truth than anyone. I needed that key. I followed him. When he saw me, he panicked, stumbled. That part was luck." "Claudia's wound?" she asked. "I cut her," he said quietly, "not deeply, enough to distract, make it all look messy." Jane nodded slowly. "So you plan to vanish after this? Take the last tool, the dagger, and disappear?" He didn't answer. She looked at him, truly looked now, not the inspector, not the man in charge, but the boy raised in the long shadow of St. Dymphna's, told stories of flame and rot and purity and ruin, and who had come back to snuff out the last candle. "You nearly succeeded," she said, "but the spiral doesn't end in fire, it ends in silence. That was Edith's final gift, refusal." He closed his eyes. The constable stepped into the room, gun drawn, and took Dunswell's arm with surprising gentleness. Dunswell did not resist. Later, as the sun finally crept through the clouds, Jane walked once more through the chapel. She paused at the altar where the rosary still lay, untouched, its beads dull, now in the clean light. She did not need to burn it. She simply picked it up, walked to the cliff's edge, and cast it out over the sea. The spiral broke not with a flame or a scream or a final stroke of violence, but with a quiet refusal to carry it forward. The case was done. This time, truly done. The air outside St. Dymphna's was crisp, briny with sea wind and heavy with the scent of salt and moss, as Jane Marple stood on the edge of the cliffs where the rosary had disappeared into the sea. Below, the waves continued their endless rhythm, indifferent to the secrets they had now claimed. Somewhere down there, tangled in kelp and pulled by the current, the final artifact of the Midnight Club's obsession was being stripped of meaning, broken apart bead by bead. She didn't feel triumphant, only still. Inside the manor, Inspector Dunswell, whose real name was Thomas Arkwright, had been taken into custody. The local constabulary was still in disbelief, wrestling with the revelation that their lead investigator had, in truth, been a long-buried descendant of the very cult they thought they had unraveled. But Miss Marple had known. Known not from any grand confession, but from the tiniest of things. The key had been in the language, not the words he spoke, but the ones he didn't. When he questioned Claudia, he had never once asked why Edith had written spirals within, only what she meant by it, as though he already knew the answer. She turned back from the cliff, walking slowly up the path as the manor came into view again, familiar and strange all at once. One part of the web had been severed, but others stretched beyond what even she could see. That was the danger of beliefs cloaked in symbols. They did not die when the people died. They lingered in the minds of those left behind. She returned to the drawing room where Claudia now sat by the hearth, no longer drugged or grieving, just silent, hands clasped in her lap. He was always the quiet one, Claudia murmured as Jane entered. Listened more than he spoke. I suppose that should have worried me. Jane sat opposite her. He believed he was ending something. In his mind, it was justice. And in yours? In mine, Jane said. Justice is never so tidy. He destroyed evidence, manipulated witnesses, nearly killed Halcombe. But more than that, he tried to take away choice. And that cannot be forgiven. Claudia looked at her. But the club is gone now, isn't it? Miss Marple gave the faintest shake of her head. It's broken, but not gone. Ideas like that don't disappear. They change. They adapt. Someone will find the journals, or remember the stories, perhaps even try to resurrect the flame. Would you stop them? If I can, Jane said softly, though I suspect next time it will be someone else who must. That evening, as she prepared to leave the manor for the last time, a small satchel slung over her shoulder, she took one final walk through the library, the heart of the Midnight Club's rituals. The books were still there, neatly shelved, many with their dangerous margins now scorched or torn, but the air had changed. No longer reverent, no longer secretive, just still. As she reached the doorway, she stopped. On the desk sat an envelope. It hadn't been there that morning. She picked it up. Her name was written in careful, looping script, Miss Jane Marple. Inside, a single page. You were right about the dagger, and the rosary, and the spiral, but you missed one thing. The flame was never an object. It was a vow, and vows don't burn. M. Mabel. The name hit her like a cold wind. Jane read it again, then turned it over. No return address, no indication of when or how it had arrived. The handwriting was unmistakable, steady, elegant, trained. So Mabel was alive and watching. Jane's thoughts flew back to that first night, the moment Mabel's absence was reported. The way the garden gate had been left ajar, not broken, not forced. A clean departure, one step ahead of all of them. And she'd remained one step ahead. It hadn't been Dunswell who had taken the dagger after all. It had been her, the dagger, the documents, perhaps more. Miss Marple closed her eyes, letting out a long, soft breath. She had solved the murders, exposed the deception, but she had not reached the end. Because the final truth was this. Mabel hadn't fled out of fear. She had walked away to begin again. There would be no trial, no confession, no final reckoning in a courtroom. Just the knowledge that somewhere out there, a woman who once walked in circles of ritual and silence now carried the flame in a new form, untethered, unrepentant, and still cloaked in shadows. Back in the library, Jane lit the envelope's edge on the fireplace's lingering coals. The flame licked upward, hungrily consuming the page. As it curled and blackened, she whispered, not to the room, but to the shadows beyond it. You've had your warning, my dear. And now I've had mine. The page crumbled to ash, and with that she turned and left the manor behind. St. Dymphna's fell quiet once more as the spiral, unbroken but cracked, turned on. The road away from St. Dymphna's wound through ancient forest, sun-dappled now in the late afternoon, the storm-washed earth soft beneath the wheels of the modest hired car that carried Miss Marple back toward the village. Her gloved hands rested quietly in her lap, eyes fixed on the trees as they passed, her thoughts far from the present moment. Though justice had found a shape, partial, flawed, yet something close to complete, there was a weight that refused to lift. She had lived long enough to know that some resolutions were performances, that truth didn't always walk neatly behind consequence. Sometimes it slipped sideways, cloaked in good intentions, or vanished in the moment you dared to believe the story was over. And that weight sat in the form of a name, Mabel, the envelope, the letter, the final line, The flame was never an object, it was a vow. Mabel hadn't just escaped the noose of suspicion, she had sidestepped the very concept of guilt. She had watched it all unfold: Edith's death, Lena's collapse, Claudia's wound, Halcom's fall, and said nothing. She had disappeared not to hide, but to transform. It left Jane wondering what kind of vow the woman now carried. The car slowed as it reached a bend in the road. A farmer moved his flock across the path. A patient old man Jane had met once before on a walk into the village. As they waited, Jane's gaze drifted over the landscape beyond. The ruined tower of an old abbey in the distance, half hidden by trees, long abandoned but still stubbornly upright. She recalled a conversation in passing, days ago now, maybe more, when Halcom had mentioned it. It wasn't always St. Dymphna's, you know. Before the manor, before the nuns, there was a monastic order that kept the land. They left in a hurry, it said, took their relics and vanished. Some say they built tunnels, others that they never left at all. At the time, it had sounded like local color, folklore. But now, in light of what had emerged, secret chambers beneath the garden, a hidden map etched in Edith's journals, the missing dagger, Jane could not help but see a lingering thread. She reached into her handbag and pulled out the page Claudia had recovered during the first days of the investigation. Not Edith's map, the other one, the one with odd numerals and sketched ruins, dismissed as the ramblings of a woman deep in delusion. Jane had nearly tossed it until now. The symbols, at first glance, looked nonsensical, but Miss Marple knew symbols better than most. It had taken time and a quiet hour of thought after the last fire had been doused, but she'd recognized the pattern. It wasn't a spiral, it was a lock. Coordinates, perhaps, or a code meant only for those who had been initiated. At the center, faint but visible in the low sunlight of the car's window, was a stylized M, not the first letter of a name, not even an initial, a sigil. Jane folded the page again, slowly, carefully, and slid it back into her bag. Behind her, St. Dymphna's was shrinking into the trees, its spires and stone cloisters retreating into the shadows of memory. But the mystery hadn't ended there. Not really. And perhaps it never had. Some crimes unravel themselves in tidy circles, others reveal their shape in time. But there were mysteries Jane knew that breathed deeper, beneath rituals and symbols, beneath generations and graves. She leaned slightly to the driver. "Do you know the old abbey ruins near the village?" she asked lightly. The man gave a short nod. "Aye, nothing left but stones and ghosts. Why?" Jane smiled. "I think I'd like to take a walk there, before dinner." The driver shrugged, turning the wheel gently as the last of the sheep crossed. The path ahead was quiet again. As the car rolled onward, Jane sat back and allowed her thoughts to settle, focusing now not on who had committed the last crime, but who had set the very first stone in place, and more importantly, who might be moving the next. Somewhere out there, Mabel watched, perhaps from across the sea, perhaps from a nearby village under a different name, perhaps even from behind the curtain of another monastery or a small chapel. No one looked at too closely. Jane would find her in time, not through force, not through vengeance, but through patience. The spiral was no longer whole, but its shape could still be traced if one knew where to look, and Jane Marple always knew where to look.